I've always lived in small towns. There's something comforting about knowing your neighbors, recognizing faces at the grocery store, and waving to the mailman every morning. But I've also learned that small towns keep secrets. And sometimes, those secrets are the kind that don't want to be found. I found that out when the house next door finally got new tenants. The house had been empty for almost 2 years. It wasn't abandoned exactly. The grass was cut, the windows were intact, but no one ever lived there. Just a husk of a home, a relic in a town where nothing ever changed. Until they moved in. It was a Monday afternoon when I saw the moving truck pull up. A single pickup, not one of those huge corporate trucks, just an old Ford filled with boxes and a few pieces of mismatched furniture. The new tenants were a man and his teenage daughter. The man was in his mid-40s, lean with sharp features, dressed in a plain flannel and jeans. He barely acknowledged me as he carried boxes inside. His daughter, maybe 16 or 17, was a different story. She was pale, almost sickly looking, with deep purple bruises under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. She stood near the front porch, arms wrapped around herself, scanning the neighborhood like she was searching for an escape route. I offered a friendly wave. She hesitated before raising her hand slightly, her fingers twitching like the gesture was foreign to her. That was the first time I felt it, the unease. Something about them wasn't right. The first few nights, nothing happened. The house remained dark, curtains drawn at all hours. Then, on the fourth night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. But as I sat up in bed, I realized it was coming from next door. It was a rhythmic knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Precise, unwavering. It didn't come from the front door. It sounded deeper inside the house, like someone knocking on a wall or a floorboard. I checked the clock, 2:12 a.m. It continued for exactly 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I told myself it was just an old house settling, but deep down, I didn't believe that. A week passed, and I barely saw them. The father left early in the morning and came back late at night. The daughter never left the house. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I finally saw her again. She was standing at the window, her eyes locked on me. I hesitated before giving a small wave. Instead of waving back, she pressed her fingertips at the glass and mouthed something. At first, I didn't understand. Then I realized, "Help me." A chill ran down my spine. Before I could react, the curtain snapped shut. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening in that house, something bad. That night, I stayed awake, watching. Around midnight, the father came home. He parked in the driveway, sat in his truck for a long time, just staring at the house. Then he got out and walked inside. A light flickered on. In the basement. I had never seen the basement light on before. Then, through the silence of the night, I heard muffled crying. It was her. And it was coming from below the house. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, the desperation in her eyes. Maybe it was the knocking at night, the eerie stillness of the house. Or maybe I just knew deep down that if I didn't act, no one would. The father left for work early. By 7 a.m. the house was silent. I walked to the side door and tried the handle. Unlocked. I stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. The house was eerily clean, almost too clean, like it had been scrubbed down over and over again. I moved through the living room, past the empty kitchen, until I reached the basement door. It had 3 heavy-duty locks. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then a whisper. "Please." It was her. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the kitchen and swung it at the locks. The second one snapped open on impact. I hit it again. The third lock broke apart. I yanked the door open. The basement was small and windowless. A single mattress on the floor, blankets crumpled in the corner, a metal chair, a chain bolted into the wall, and her. She was huddled in the corner, eyes wide with terror. "We have to go," I whispered. "Now." She hesitated for only a second before scrambling to her feet. We rushed up the stairs, through the house, and out the door. We made it halfway down the street before I heard it. The roar of an engine. I turned just in time to see the father's truck speeding toward us. I grabbed her wrist and ran. We cut through yards, over fences. The truck skidded onto the curb behind us. "Stop!" the father screamed. We kept running. Somewhere behind us, I heard sirens. The girl stumbled. I caught her, pulling her toward a side street. The police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of us. "Help her!" I gasped, shoving the girl toward them. He kept her locked up, in the basement." The father's truck stopped. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He just stared at us as they cuffed him, and then, as they put him in the back of the police car, he smiled. Not with anger, not with regret, but with certainty. Like he knew something we didn't. The girl's name was Hannah. She had been missing for 6 months. She wasn't his daughter. She had been taken from a city 3 states away. No one knew why. The father, if that's what he even was, refused to speak. Not to the police, not to lawyers, not to anyone. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his cell. Ruled a suicide. I moved into my apartment complex 6 months ago, drawn in by the cheap rent and the promise of a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't anything special, just a typical mid-rise building in a mid-sized city, the kind of place where people mind their own business and barely acknowledge each other in the hallways. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking for friends, just a fresh start. But then I noticed my neighbor in 4B. At first, it was little things, odd noises late at night, soft tapping against the walls, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes erratic, footsteps pacing back and forth at impossible hours, the faint sound of whispers, too muffled to make out words. It wasn't just me who noticed. One night, while grabbing my mail, I ran into Mrs. Thompson from 4D. She was in her 70s, sharp as ever, the kind of woman who had lived in the building long enough to notice when something changed. She leaned in and lowered her voice. "Have you met the one in 4B yet?" I shook my head. "No." "Why?" She pursed her lips. "Just keep your distance." That should have been my first warning. A week later, I was coming home late from work when I saw him for the first time. He was standing in front of his door, keys in hand, not moving. Just standing there, staring at the wood as if he'd forgotten what he was supposed to do. His clothes were plain, dark jeans, a faded hoodie, but something about him felt off. His posture was too rigid. His head tilted slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I cleared my throat. "Hey man, everything okay?" He didn't react at first. Then slowly, he turned his head toward me. Not his body, just his head. And he smiled. Not a normal smile. Too wide, too slow. It made my stomach twist. "Good night," he whispered, voice too soft, too deliberate. Then he turned back to his door and walked inside without unlocking it. I stood there for a long time staring at 4B, heart pounding. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. The noises became more frequent. Scraping sounds against the walls, low, guttural humming that never seemed to stop, and the smell, something metallic like rust seeping from under his door. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard something new. Laughter. But it wasn't right. It was too slow, too forced, like someone mimicking what laughter was supposed to sound like. I pressed my ear against the wall, and then knocking. Not on my door, on the wall separating our apartments. A steady, deliberate knock, knock, knock. I didn't respond. I should have moved out then and there. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. I bought a cheap security camera and pointed it at the hallway, just outside my door. I wanted to know what he was doing at night, why the noises never stopped. The next morning, I checked the footage. At 1:23 a.m., my neighbor opened his door. But he didn't step out. He just stood there, half hidden in the doorway, facing my camera, watching. For 2 hours, he didn't move. Then at 3:33 a.m., his head tilted sharply, like he'd heard something. And he turned toward my door. I shut off the footage. I called my landlord, demanded to know who this guy was. The landlord hesitated. 4B, that unit's supposed to be empty. My blood went cold. "What do you mean empty?" I asked. "I see him every day." Silence. "Then, I'll check the records. But, be careful." That night, I barricaded my door, stacked furniture against it, slept with a knife under my pillow. At 2:55 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my doorknob turning. Not shaking, not jiggling, turning. Like someone had a key. I didn't breathe, didn't move. Then, from the other side of the door, came a voice. "Good night." I stayed awake until dawn. By the time morning came, 4B was empty. The door wide open, but inside there was nothing. No furniture, no belongings. Just an empty, dust-covered room. The landlord swore no one had rented it in years. I moved out that day. I don't know what was in 4B. I don't want to know. Ever since then, I have been haunted by that room,